So the Emperor's own Golden Boys got a nice points update in the balanced data slate, and many of their most scary rivals have been significantly toned down. Let's talk about the Adeptus Custodes and how they might be taken to the table with their latest points and rules. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Custodes, and in this video I thought we'd go through an overview of their army, focusing on a few of the units that just got quite a lot better with the balanced data slate, but also taking just general stock of the faction, and where they might be going from here with their Codex on the way. Previously in Warhammer 40k, the Adeptus Custodes were ranking as one of the weakest armies in 40k 10th edition. Tournament win rates were hovering around the 43 to 44 sort of percent at grand tournaments, really struggling compared with most there. And for the amount of people playing them, a fairly particularly poor event win rate, not too many people having success at the higher levels of play. Despite this, in more casual games I still would have rated Custodes as not really awful. They just tend to be one of the armies that marches up the board and forces the opponents to deal with some fairly massive profiles and general purpose melee damage. More optimised armies often might be able to, but less optimised newer players might really struggle. I'd say that compared with plenty of other factions out there in 40k, there's far less difference between a really badly optimised Custodes list and a really highly optimised one. At least say compared with other armies with tons of unit choice, say Space Marines, Eldar or Astra Militarum. In any case though, it does look like the balanced data slate did bring some really quite nice buffs for the Custodes. Points cuts on the core of their army, really focused around the plastic Custodes datasheets rather than the resin Forge World ones, which I think isn't the worst in the world for collecting practicalities. They also fixed the detachment nerf that the Custodes took, which almost felt like a bit of a byproduct of the way that they messed around with devastating wounds to fix Eldar, and that change was really quite nice to see. And another benefit was clarifying the ignores modifiers ruling in a way that helped Trajan Valoris, ruling that questionable ability worked in the most powerful possible way that it could, making the Watcher's Axe particularly good at going through certain enemies. In this video I thought I'd do a bit of a general overview of Custodes in the new 40k, talk through the latest points changes for things that went down and how good I think that practically makes them, go through some of the other choices in the index and which ones are strongest overall right now, look at one example army list that you can build with these new cheaper points, and talk about a few possibilities for their upcoming codex. Lots to talk through, so let's jump into it. First up, starting with that detachment rule change, the Aegis of the Emperor was made a lot more useful. In the last balanced data slate, it was a save against mortal wounds of a 4+, a damage type that's particularly effective against Custodes, and that was really quite nice as it also worked against devastating wounds, which were mortal wounds before the update. The ability got massively worse when Games Workshop made devastating wounds no longer mortal wounds. It was just far less relevant against the field and only good for certain things like certain datasheet abilities or vehicle explodes and things. It was perhaps one of the single biggest fan requests to put that back, and at least at some point, to the way it was. And that's probably what Games Workshop did. Their detachment ability gives you a 4+ save against devastating wounds too. I think that was a very sensible change, particularly as both mortal and devastating wounds are some of the things that Custodes miniatures would normally have to fear the most. They rely on their high toughness, high saves and high invulnerable saves to get them by, so anything that just bypasses all of those defences is really potent. I think this will definitely help them out. Devastating wounds are common enough to be a meaningful boost, so nice to have the chunky golden boys protected by the Emperor's mercy just that little bit more than they were. Overall, a small but solid boost to the army, a bit more relevant against some foes than others though I suppose. Moving into the points changes, and first up we have the Custodian Guard. They went down to 180 or 225 points for 4 or 5 of them, down from either 200 or 250. Basically 50 points per model drops to 45, a percentage change of -10%. Definitely a solid boost to their efficiency there. At 45 points, I think they're back up to being really quite a durable unit for the cost. 3 or 4 wounds at T6 with a 2+ save and a 4+ invulnerable is a challenge for many armies to handle. Certainly small arms tend to bounce right off them, and Custodian Guard are the datasheet in the army that has some particularly interesting damage boost abilities, double shooting for a turn to cut through some chaff with some Guardian Spear shooting, and rerolls against enemies on objectives, which is really nice to allow those Guardian Spears to punch up. I think they were solid enough before and certainly were seeing play in competitive lists. Having a 10% points decrease on these is very, very meaningful indeed. Say if you're investing something like 1,000 points between Custodian Guard, Wardens and Alaris Terminators, there's a good chance that you might be able to get an extra body or two there, and every extra Custodian body really is a force to be reckoned with. Otherwise, falling in line with the Custodian Guard are the Wardens. Previously, they were 220 points for 4 or 275 for 5, and they've dropped down to 200 or 250, kind of a similar percentage change at 9%. Again, I feel like they were kind of well balanced against the Custodian Guard, really. The Custodian Guard are the ones that you go for if you want out and out damage, the Wardens if you want big defense stats. If they're with a character, they get their -1 to wound, and they have the big turn of 4+ feel no pain. They're pretty solid with Trajan, a Blade Champion, or a Shield Captain. They perhaps feel particularly good to me to go with Trajan Valoris, who just brings a bit of raw power up in their damage while they handle the defense. Again, it's a solid points cut to one of the best units in the army. Overall, will absolutely boost the strength of the faction. Next up, we have the Adeptus Custodians that go down from 70 points each to 65, a percentage change of 7%, so not really quite as big a cut as the other two, but not really all that far off. Again, I feel like these guys are pretty well balanced with the previous datasheets, just offering different things. The Adeptus can be taken in units that don't cost quite so much at 130 points now, and that combined with their teleport movement shenanigans means that they can be quite a good custodian unit to do scoring things, and could often just annoyingly survive enemy shooting with their big stats. On the offensive as well, they get their bonus against big scary things in the enemy army, being a bit better at handling the tough stuff compared with the rank and file. And between those two abilities, they still seem very handy to have around, again definitely cropping up in competitive lists. As with the other two, a competitive unit going down really makes them stand out. I feel like all three of them, Custodian, Guard, Wardens, and Alaris, really are going to be even more head and shoulders above most of the other datasheets now. Next up, and maybe trailing the others by a little bit, are the Virtus Praetors, everyone's favourite Dawn Eagle bikes, with the fast and hard-hitting Interceptor Lancers. Previously they were 80 points each, now they're 75 and they're units of 2 or 3. A slightly smaller percentage decrease compared with the rest of -6%, again a bit less than the others, and even less so than the Terminators. I'd say for that reason they're probably still going to be more niche than those other datasheets just mentioned, just because unlike the rest, the Virtus Praetors really weren't seeing that much play before. I feel like if they wanted to even up the balance a little bit, they probably could have dropped them by a little bit further. I feel like 145 or 140 points per unit would really make them a lot more appealing, but even with this cut they've definitely got better compared with what they were. After the change, I'd consider them to compete a fair bit better with the Venatari Jump Pack Custodians from Forge World, which I think were generally the better choice if you wanted fast-moving melee units. They do have their advantages with their +1 to wound, fast movement, and a little bit of somewhat meaningful shooting. I still don't think we're going to be going back to seeing them spammed en masse though. Finally, and for the biggest relative percentage drop in the index points changes, we've got the Captain on Dawn Eagle jet bike. The Flying Shield Captain got a drop down from 180 points down to 140, really quite a massive drop of -23% there. Far, far bigger than the others, though I do admit that I think that he was just very, very overcosted before, kind of weirdly so. At least now he costs a little bit less than the two Virtus Praetors that you could have taken instead of him. He offers a few things, the opportunity to get 0 CP battle tactic stratagems, maybe a little bit more niche on the bikes compared with the infantry, and they often already have the +1 to wound that they might want. Still though, I guess even just re-rolling failed saves with command point re-rolls can be kinda big when you've got 4+ invulnerables going on. Otherwise he gets you bonus to your consolidate, so you might have the chance to charge down and kill one enemy unit, then consolidate into the next at a greater range. And he gets one big movement shenanigan once per game at the end of the fight phase, potentially drawing the bikers back or hiding them away. You could also use him to get an enhancement in the Virtus Praetors if you wanted, I guess. Overall, I'd say that even at 140 points, given that the Virtus Praetors still feel just a little bit overcosted to me, is probably still not standout, but at least it's no longer dreadful. The 180 points was ridiculous, 140 points seems far, far more in line with his abilities. Those are the primary points changes, and out of those units I would rate the Custodian Guard, Wardens and Alaris Terminators to be perhaps the pick of the points cuts, and are going to form the centre of most armies with their core damage dealers. Besides that though, the rest of the Index and Forge World definitely do have some good support. For the Sisters of Silence, I'd weigh up between cheap Prosecutors or Witch Seekers as cheap nuisance units to hold points and score. 40 points is quite nice for just any unit in 40k, just literally for utility. They're not going to deal loads of damage, but that's not really their point. They sit on objectives, maybe do a bit of screening, maybe do some secondary grunt work if needed. Witch Seekers I think are genuinely an interesting upgrade for the extra 10 points for their extra utility. They're still cheap at 50 points, but actually do some genuinely meaningful damage to light infantry with their mass flamers. And getting scouts is pretty nice on them as well, so you could have chaff units right into the midfield straight away if it made sense. If you have 10 points left over at the end of the list, I feel like this is a pretty reasonable way to expend them. Otherwise, for the more standout characters, I'd rate Trajan Valoris the Blade Champion and the On-Foot Shield Captain as my favourites. Trajan Valoris brings his Moment Shackle to basically gain the edge in a fight phase. As mentioned, his Ignores modifier buff got a bit better given the balanced data slate FAQs. Previously, it just wasn't entirely clear which bits he got to ignore, but now he definitely gets to ignore anything that modifies the AP of his attacks or the damage of his weapon, so you could be hitting a Redemptor Dreadnought with Armour of Contempt on the go and a -1 damage rule and ignore both of those things. He was already taken in quite a lot of competitive lists, and that's not going to hurt him at all. Otherwise, the Blade Champion can be good for delivering a unit to longer range, and then has a nice general purpose punchy profile in melee, not too bad with Custodian Guard perhaps to make some long charges onto objectives. And Shield Captain on foot is still really good for his free stratagems, plenty of meaningful battle tactic ones with +1 to wounds or -1 to damage for your units to make them extra tough, and the bonus Martial Qatar stance certainly doesn't hurt in combat either. Otherwise, for the Forge World units, given that they didn't see drops at the same rate as the other units, I feel like most things are going to be more overshadowed now. I still say that the Caladius Grav Tank is a standout good unit, nice solid fast moving anti-tank that hits on a 2+, and a sturdy tank profile to back that up, can't really go too far wrong. And out of the other units, maybe my favourite might be the Venatari Custodians, sacrificing some raw damage and defense for speed, and the infantry keyword makes them a lot easier to interact with terrain versus Virtus Praetors. Though the Virtus Praetors might hit a bit harder on the charge given the Interceptor Lances and the +1 to wound. There's a bit of advantage to either of them really. Otherwise, for other support for Imperial agents, the Calidus Assassin can pair pretty well with them, an annoying lone operative to bounce around the board doing secondary objectives. Really an awful choice in just about any Imperial list. I have seen a few lists using Kyria Draxus, who's pretty interesting with her shielding the unit from harm, plus actually has some meaningful shooting that can combo very nicely with the Custodian Guard special rules, perhaps one of the better allied choices out of the options. I'm not necessarily saying that there's other things that aren't playable. I think that the Custodian Land Raider is quite fun as well, given that it hits on a 2+, and you can carry quite a meaty amount of dangerous Custodians into combat that way. A few of the other Forge World things I think are okay, but maybe not quite as standout as the units listed here. Putting that together, here's just one idea for a rough army list for 2000 points for Custodes in 10th edition. Not really meant to be super optimal or anything like that, but I wouldn't be too surprised if until the Codex Custodes do have some sort of variation that's not too dissimilar for this, they could definitely emphasise or de-emphasise different elements. The list is led by Trajan Valoris and the Blade Champion with the Veiled Blade for a big extra damage boost. Trajan Valoris can lead a unit of Custodian Wardens with the Spears. The Blade Champion can lead a unit of Custodian Guard with mainly Spears, 1 Shield and 1 Vexilla, and they can be delivered to the midfield objectives. And following alongside them is another more standard unit of Custodian Guard, just 4 of them. Then for doing teleport tricks and lending a hand against tougher targets, there are 3 units of 2 Alorus Custodians with the Guardian Spears, 1 small unit of Prosecutors, and 1 small unit of Witch Seekers for a little bit of screening or objective support, 2 Caladius tanks to lend a hand into armour at long range, and a Calidus Assassin to jump round the board doing secondary objectives, and can also contribute a bit to ruining an enemy stratagem, maybe even trying to actually assassinate a character if one is actually easy to do. I feel like that could be okay for a somewhat balanced Custodians list. Maybe one option could be to drop a couple of Terminators to get a captain for the other Custodian Guard unit. That could be another fun option. It might not be too long that we have to wait before Custodians get more updates though. They do have a Codex coming fairly soon in Warhammer 40k, though I'd guess that the points and rules changes up to that point will have Custodians functioning as far more of a mid-tier army compared with where they were, and no longer the weakest in Warhammer 40k. I feel like it might honestly be the Space Marines that might be heading that way, given the nerfs that they got to a few key units that they sort of relied on to score. The Custodians decks should be coming out fairly soon though. Games Workshop had teased that it will be spring 2024, so I guess could be any time between now to June technically. I guess it will probably be sooner rather than later though, maybe sometime after the Tau launch box, seeing as we've seen that unveiled, but before the Chaos Space Marine Codex comes out, given that we haven't even seen a model tease for that army yet. Probably the most interesting thing it's going to add is adding in some new detachments, It'll be interesting to see what sort of army archetypes get supported. I really wouldn't be too surprised if we get some sort of Sisters of Silence centered detachment. It's not exactly an army that has a ton of datasheets and sub-themes, but they're certainly the biggest one within the army. Will be interesting to see if they could actually try and make them into an army that you want to run quite a lot of them in their own right. Otherwise, I could see them maybe doing some sort of teleport shenanigan thing like Grey Knights or Necron Hypercrypt, which could be an interesting way to play if they did decide to go that way. Maybe some sort of Golden Light shenanigans like Dreadhost. I guess they do have other Custodian army archetypes to fall back on though from the Shield host that they had in previous editions. Maybe some swift moving Emissaries Imperatus, or shadowy character assassins of the Shadow Keepers. We do know that there's at least going to be one new unit as well, with this intriguing crested Custodian with a Melter Spear. I'd guess he'd probably be a character unit given the cool crest that he's got going for him. I think it would be really fun if this just turns out to be a new squad in its own right though. Shields and Melter Spears will be really quite fun for a Custodian unit to maybe be dedicated for taking down tanks and armour perhaps. Either way, I look forward to finding out what it is. Let me know your thoughts though. What do you make of the Custodian points changes, and are you looking forward to the Codex when it drops? What sort of army list are you going to be looking to put on the table till then? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.